Hello everyone, so yeah, this is the title of my talk. It's a bit misleading because it will be more about post-operaism, this strand of Italian Marxism, and it will come back to, like, at the end I will come to talk a bit about the Pittsburgh School, kind of like also asking the same questions as the last presenter about the origin of normativity, but in a much more like, I don't go into so much technical detail, so it's more like reading, using Brandom and also like Justin Evans's reading of Brandom to sort of critique this strand of Marxist thought. So yeah, I will read from my paper and I have some slides. Okay. The concept of the general intellect is a notoriously equivocal one. Despite the fact that it only appears once in the entirety of Marx's work, it has been used and abused in various ways in the last couple of decades. It appears in the famous section of the Grundrisse, which was later to be known as a fragment of machines, where Marx discussed the incorporation of social knowledge in industrial machinery. The fragment is notable for its discussion of machinery as an automaton consisting of numerous mechanical and intellectual organs, and for its sketch of a crisis theory of capital, which differs considerably from other parts of Marx's work. Both of these themes shape the influential reading put forward by Italian operaismo and post-operaismo. Here I will set aside the discussion and critiques of this crisis theory to instead focus on the relationship between technology, labor, collective intelligence, and capital that Marx sketches out using terms such as social intellect, social brain, and most famously the general intellect. According to Matteo Pasquinelli, the fragment contains, I quote, an unresolved tension between knowledge objectified in machinery as development of fixed capital and knowledge expressed by social production as development of the social individual. Now, the post-operaist reading argues that Marx overemphasizes the former, so knowledge objectified in machinery, to the detriment of the latter. Theorists like Paolo Virno, Antonio Negri, and Carlo Vercellone all argue that Marx's account of the general intellect is one-sided and that it ought to be supplemented or even criticized. Virno, who I will focus mostly on this talk, argues that the fragment posits the coincidence of the general intellect with fixed capital as a collective knowledge objectified machinery, and that this neglects how it also manifests itself in and as living labor. According to Virno, the social knowledge that sits at the center of the production process in our times is not only and not even primarily to be found materialized in machines and technology, but also found in skill, talent, aptitude, and habits, or what he calls mass intellectuality. This reading of the general intellect is also part and parcel of a broader historical account of labor in post-industrial societies. Virno maintains that the logic of economic development requires a part of the general intellect not to congeal as fixed capital, but to unfold in communicative interaction. In a similar vein, Carlo Vercellone claims that in this new phase of capitalism, the general intellect is, I quote, no longer encapsulated in the rigid logic incorporated in machines, and that the traditional opposition between dead labor and living labor proper to industrial capitalism gives way to a new form of antagonism, that between the dead knowledge of capital and the living knowledge of labor. The post-operaist periodization of capital and their particular reading of the fragment have all been widely discussed and criticized. However, rather than rehearsing those critiques, I would like to focus on Virno's understanding of the general intellect as being grounded on the communicative capacities and linguistic faculties that enable cooperation. My purpose with this is to criticize the post-operaist view that places living labor as the site of a collective intelligence capable of escaping the capital-labor dialectic. Operaismo and its legacy have been characterized by what Mario Tronti famously called a Copernican revolution in the priority given to labor in the development of the capital-labor relation. Thus, one of their central contributions has been their repeated attempts to focus on living labor rather than abstract labor. Although this has provided a useful counterpoint to heavily value-centric approaches which focus primarily on abstract labor and the totalizing dialectic of capital itself, perhaps we ought to be more cautious before accepting this conceptual move at face value. Pasquinelli notes that the issue of collective knowledge should never be separated from its embodiment in machines, and that contemporary technologies have effectively reminded us that knowledge can be analyzed measured, and automated as successfully as manual labor. In other words, prioritizing living labor should not lead us to postulate hard technological limits to the process of mechanization of the mind and automation of non-manual forms of labor. However, rather than following this thread, which would probably take us to the domain of machine learning and large language models, I want to briefly explore a way in which the very element of living labor that people like Virno and Berchellones say that endows labor with its potential for autonomy, so language, communicative capacities, and so on, how this aspect of living labor can be already considered as being shaped or constrained by the value form. I want to explore another way in which this linguistic operation that lies at the heart of contemporary forms of labor is already mediated by the value abstraction without being technologically objectified. And to do this, I will first turn to Virno's philosophy of language. Okay. In Virno's hands, the concept of the general intellect is anthropologized and transformed into a broader concept which designates something like the cognitive, social, and linguistic capacities of human beings that cannot be objectified in machinery. He posits that, I quote, general intellect should not necessarily mean the aggregate of the knowledge acquired by the species, but the faculty of thinking, potential as such, not its countless particular realizations. The general intellect is nothing but the intellect in general. Determined primarily by living labor, the general intellect is constituted by, I quote again, the infinite variety of concepts and logical schemes which cannot ever be set within fixed capital, being inseparable from the reiteration of a plurality of living subjects. In most of Virno's writings, his attempt to define the general intellect does not go beyond a series of somewhat vague articulations and haphazard list of what it supposedly encompasses. And those are a couple of examples. So to just put an example, he says, the general intellect includes, I quote, communication, abstraction, self-reflection of living subjects, epistemic paradigms, dialogical performances, linguistic games, the complex of cognitive paradigms, artificial languages, conceptual clusters with etc., etc., the commonplaces of the mind, the communicative capacities and cognitive linguistic habits of the species, and the list goes on. However, in his book titled When the World Becomes Flesh, Language and Human Nature, he goes a little bit deeper into a problem to try to articulate what this, to articulate like a philosophy of language. And to contextualize a little bit, Virno's eclectic approach in this book can be situated within the broader context of an Italian tradition in philosophy of language that can be traced all the way back to Dante and Vico. This tradition can be seen as a non-naturalistic philosophy of the faculty of speaking and as a combination of political philosophy with a form of linguistic anthropology. Many of the authors writing within this tradition are concerned not with the truth conditions of statements, nor with the deconstruction of linguistic representations, but rather with an understanding of language, as a form of social practice and as the site of the production of subjectivity. While linguistic practice is entirely material and worldly, this tradition mostly centers its attention on enunciation and on its transcendental conditions of possibility. In this way, it understands the transcendental structure of enunciation as a general structure of human praxis and the specific potentiality of the species. Like several authors working in this tradition, Virno's theory of language gives philosophical centrality to the notion of potentiality. For him, the linguistic faculty constitutes the site of a potentiality specific to the human species. This is a perspective which is analog or complementary to those that place the potential for labor at the center of Marx's notion of species being. So, drawing from the work of linguists such as Saussure and Benveniste, Virno posits the existence of a faculty of language which is logically distinguishable from specific historical languages and from the speech or utterances they may produce. And according to him, it is the linguistic faculty itself and not its concrete instantiations that is being put to work by capital. So, like to move on to like a critique of this approach. Giuseppina Meccia, who's a translator of this book, argues that Virno's conception of the linguistic faculty is hard to connect with social practice and concrete political concerns. We might go ahead and accept the post-operaist proposition that contemporary capitalism is based on the communicative and linguistic faculties of the general intellect, but then, as Mecchia quips, we might as well ask what the general intellect is saying, or even more importantly, what it is able to say in virtue of how the space of available justifications is configured. According to her, Virno's philosophy of language rejects those sort of questions, I quote, abandoning the issue of speech in order to focus on language itself and the onto-phenomenological characterization of the human speaker in a deeply melancholic move that risks leaving us in the impossibility to conceive the determinations of actual socio-political interventions. Virno's retreat to language as potentiality does not offer any hint of what a semantic approach to the general intellect could look like, and would even seem to foreclose such a prospect. One could see Virno's retreat as analogous to the kind of philosophical move already criticized by. I just changed this slide. Already criticized by Marx and Engels in the German ideology. There they write, I quote, "One of the most difficult tasks confronting philosophers is to descend from the world of thought to the actual world. Language is the immediate actuality of thought. Just as philosophers have given thought an independent existence, so they were bound to make language into an independent realm." And Ewald Ilienkov comments on this passage in that book, and he says that this problem arises merely from the view that language and thought are separate spheres organized according to their own immanent rules and laws rather than forms of expressions of real life, of the objective being of men and things. And then I pose the question, could we turn towards another theory of language which is able to understand it as an expression of the objective being of the general intellect, rather than as a transhistorical faculty of the human species? To move on to the last part, the Pittsburgh School. Many of the Pittsburgh School's central concerns also hinge on the question of language and its fundamental role in thought, perception, action, and sociality. Contrary to Virno, however, authors of this current start from a pragmatist framework concerned with language as it unfolds in practice, rather than with language as a transcendental faculty separate from actual speech acts and language games. More specifically, they approach language from a social pragmatist framework, which, as Carl Sachs points out, I quote, holds all questions of content, meaning, aboutness, etc. are really questions about norms, and that norms are only intelligible in terms of social practices. So in other words, this normativity is not a transcendent set of rules that are applied to individual behavior, but rather, similar to Wittgenstein's language games, they are rules which are instituted by our social practices themselves and which we engage at all times as the norm-governed creatures that we are. Sellers coins the concept of the space of reasons to describe the logical space of justifying and being able to justify what one says. Although in his work it arises in the context of epistemological inquiry, this concept has been developed by Brandom into a broader normative inferentialist theory of meaning and of intersubjective linguistic practice. Risking oversimplification, the space of reasons can be roughly understood as the inferentially articulated realm of available reasons to which we are bound and through which we justify statements, beliefs, and actions to ourselves and to others. Justin Evans points out that this makes the theory more than an explanation for the possibility of knowledge. It is also a theory about what it means to be a rational human being. The space of reasons is a framework that we live with and constantly reproduce through our linguistic practices. It is the fruit of our own actions, but we are nevertheless bound by that space. Having said this, I believe that a bridge can be built between Virno's conception of the general intellect and the Pittsburgh School's understanding of linguistic practice to conceptualize something like the space of reasons of the general intellect. While bracketing the question of what implications, if any, this could have in political economic terms, this somewhat unlikely pairing may allow for two potentially useful conceptual moves. Firstly, while accepting Virno's characterization of collective intelligence as grounded on linguistic and communicative capacities, it could provide an alternative theory that avoids a retreat into an ontological realm that can hardly account for the determinations, limits, and configurations of actual linguistic practices. Secondly, opting for this non-ontologized conception of language can also allow us to contest the political implications of Virno's account. As it was mentioned above, the operaist approach has been characterized by the priority granted to labor and worker struggles in the transformation of capitalist social relations. However, this methodological standpoint has often tended to slip into an ontology of the creative plenitude of labor. As we saw in Virno's reading of the fragment, this creative plenitude of labor translates into a philosophical account of language as a faculty where the potentiality of living labor purportedly resides, untainted by the world-making protocols of value. I want to explore the idea that a pragmatist understanding of language could lend itself to a critique of this false immediacy of living labor by allowing us to think about how the linguistic capacities of the general intellect might already be mediated by the value form. I will conclude very briefly by gesturing towards this point, mostly drawing from this text by Justin Evans. Evans provides us with a couple of tools to draw some connections between Marxist thought and the Pittsburgh School's account of the space of reasons. What he proposes is to understand capitalism itself as a distorted or impoverished space of reasons. He does so by reading Brandon's neo-Hegelian version of the space of reasons against the idea, developed by several Hegelian Marxists, of capital as a self-moving substance of history. Roughly speaking, when examined through the analytic neo-Hegelian lens of the Pittsburgh School, Geist or spirit is relieved of any hint of metaphysics and becomes a historically evolving norm-governed social space constituted by reason-giving practices. By doing so, spirit or Geist is reframed as a holistic web of reasons and inferential relations of incompatibility and consequence available to justify our beliefs and practices in a specific historical context. According to Evans, the concept of the space of reasons is useful, I quote, to think through and understand everyday interactions between individuals and how those interactions are constrained by the way that we justify or decide upon our actions. The pragmatic normative structures that constrain such interactions are historically contingent, linked to specific forms of social organization. Thus, I would argue, it is not far-fetched to try and explain the constitution of such normative structures in historical materialist terms, affirming, as Federico Penella argues, that the specific forms of conceptual compromises active in class societies can be explained by making reference to specific forms of economic organization. By taking the idea of a historical materialist account of the space of reasons as a plausible hypothesis, we can take a shortcut straight into Marx's elusive comments regarding the resemblance of capital to spirit. If we read this through the lens of the Pittsburgh School's analytic neo-Hegelianism, we will end up with a very different kind of space of reasons than the one theorized by Brandon. By describing capital in terms of spirit, Marx was trying to convey the totalization of a society mediated by the imperatives of self-valorizing value and its associated impersonal principles of abstract domination. Translating this to the vocabulary space of reasons would imply understanding value as a real abstraction that is unconsciously produced in practice and comes to exert an excessive gravitational pull on the domain of social normativity as a whole. To quote Evans once again, he writes, "One particular concept, value, has come to play an outsized role in our games of asking and giving for reasons. It has taken on an excessive importance in our chains of reasoning. Our deeds and thoughts are predominantly justified by the normative concept of value. Our space of reasons hurts us towards the concept of value." William Clare Roberts, on the other hand, describes impersonal domination in a way that resonates with Evans, with the quote I just mentioned. To quote William Clare Roberts, he writes, "Marx does not argue that economic relations manipulate individuals like puppets, but that economic relations dominate the decision-making. They are not forced to act as they do, but they are subject to a kind of hazard that rules out discursive deliberation except within arbitrarily narrow parameters. They cannot get together and talk about what sorts of things should and should not be done, and what sorts of reasons should and should not count as good reasons. Now, without getting into too much detail here, it is worth pointing out a problem with which J.P. Caron has commented on. If value presents itself as an imminent limitation within the normative space, this is not because it is a normative concept, as Evan writes, but rather because it is a form of pattern-governed behavior, a mode of sociality that constitutes, I quote, the very glue that connects agents within the operational scheme of capital. And to conclude, just with two main takeaways. To conclude, let's reiterate the theoretical wager of this short intervention. The Pittsburgh School pragmatist normative approach to language allows us to exit the ontologized realm of Virno's linguistic faculty in order to situate the linguistic practices of the general intellect in a social and political context transversed by the real abstractions mobilized by capital. Likewise, the idea of capitalism as a space of reasons could potentially provide us with useful tools to contest the post-operaist idea of language as the site of a creative plenitude of labor and as an ontologized realm which can only ever stand in an external relation to capital. It goes without saying that there is certainly more work to be done if we want to bring these otherwise radically different theoretical perspectives closer together, not only to build conceptual bridges between them, but also to bring their essential incompatibilities and incommensurabilities into sharper focus. Thank you.
So I think it's probably not a very helpful question, but I guess I'm curious why, and this maybe it's a question also for you as well. When I think about the Pittsburgh School approach and I hyper-focus on language, I see that as a limitation to understanding the conditions under which we live. Whereas something like Brandon's semantic approach, like the structure that he builds out, it seems to me could be useful for getting beyond language. So actually, I thought you were going to give, I didn't think you were going to do semantics. In Marx, I thought you were going to talk about these other non-linguistic practices, or not essentially linguistic practices such as labor. And in your case, it's a similar thing because you're looking to the linguistic faculty to make sense of these capitalist structures and to analyze them, whereas I would have thought that we want to analyze praxis more broadly than that, so to get beyond the narrowness of the Pittsburgh School.
No, I think at the end I kind of mentioned this a little bit with like a comment by J.P. Caron where, so I guess it's a question about also what Giacomo was trying to do or like talk about in the presentation of like finding kind of like the origin of certain normative structures in social practice, which is why I think like the idea of thinking value as a normative concept is kind of, I would not agree with this because I think it's, if we want to like trace it back to like some sort of material genesis, we have to think it as a mode of sociality and like as I mentioned here, as a form of pattern governed behavior. So I think there's, I mean, I don't know how to do it, but I like in terms of like technical specificities, but I do agree that like we would have to go beyond language and like find this, the genesis of normativity in social practice.
My only maybe useful thought for this is to pick up a clue from Adam's talk. You mentioned Hoagland very briefly. And Hoagland gets beyond language by talking about rule following and does it in the context of games, which is very helpful because they're concrete and it's very clear, and then you can do an analogy from, in his case, from games to understanding what we're doing when we're doing science, but you can do it also more broadly to understanding how we live under capitalist conditions. And maybe that's like thinking about it in terms of rule following and the different senses of rule following that he teases out as word to world fit versus the reverse. Which way is it work? The rules working? Do the rules merely describe how things are in the world, or do the rules operate independently so I'm not explaining this very well, but I think Hoagland has resources, is what I'm trying to say.
I just want to point out, isn't the value of what Virno has brought to the table that he has pointed out to division of labor as an important element that should we be focusing on if we think about practices. If we can follow him in that intellectual labor is the prime or equal in manual labor in how capitalism is produced or produces its value. Can we now think about that as a starting point to think about practices in a general sense, how to reconfigure reflection and production or phrases and aesthetics in a general form, which maybe refers to the language games that needs upscaling that we just encountered.
Yeah, I think like the post-operaist argument and Virno as well. Yeah, I what I find value is like in the rethinking of like labor practices, rethinking of like the way that in post-industrial societies, practices of labor have changed. But what I was kind of like sideways trying to do here is like I really don't agree with the like reading of Marx's theory of value, and like how, and this goes down to the way they understand or like ontologize living labor as something that is always like kind of outside of capital, and like capital is always trying to like catch up to it. So yeah, like what I was trying to do sideways here is like trying to not to like criticize this attempt of like postulating living labor always. So like, okay, they say like living labor is nowadays mostly revolving around like language, linguistic capacities, all of this. So I was trying to put like the question of the value form, so to speak, again, like right at the center as of what they say is kind of like out of reach, you know. So that's also kind of like the gist of the critique.
So in this quote which you included on the general intellect from Virno, we read like the general intellect includes thus formal and informal knowledge, imagination, ethical propensities, mindsets, and linguistic games, sort of in scare quotes. So it's very obvious to me why this kind of accords with inferentialism and the game of giving and asking for reasons and that whole vein of thought. But I'm curious, I suppose, what this otherwise kind of quite sort of Marxy list we read there, kind of like a barrage of different things in the games. What sort of account of playfulness or the ludic do you think Marx has, and where are the differences or commonalities? Because to me this seems a very randomly kind of account that seems to strike a chord with it. But what does Marx think about being playful or ludic, or what can we integrate, or what are we going to have to read into in that?
Can you like repeat the last bit of the
Yeah,
question?
what do you think what Marx's approach to playfulness and the ludic or games or whatever, what do you think we can get? Is that something which comes to your mind now, or is this something?
I mean, I really don't know what Marx said about playfulness, to be honest.
I'm curious too, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I also don't know. No, I don't really know about that. But like about like Virno's kind of like arguments here. Yeah, that's kind of like what made the jump into kind of like Pittsburgh School, because he, on the one hand, like talks about like language games. So you're like thinking like, okay, maybe he's kind of like going like the Wittgenstein route. But like when you read the book, he's actually very into the early Wittgenstein, but like really not liking the later. So he's like retreating into talking about like transcendental faculty of language and all this. So that's kind of what sort of took me to that road, I guess.